The recording again. There we go. Great. Pardon me. My voice has been sketchy all day long. So if it does some interesting things in the next hour, please forgive me. All right, we're back now for our policy roundtable. I gave you the preview. Let's introduce the participants. So if we go to the next slide, some of these or many of these folks we've already had participate so far, but we'll just have them again briefly introduce yourself, starting at the top. Chantel.
Thank you. Sorry, I needed to take myself off mute. Hi, I'm Chantel Dodson, and I'm the head of medical affairs for the manufacturer Astellas.
Thank you. Stephanie.
Sorry, Stephanie Fabian. I am chair of the Department of Medicine at Mayo Clinic in Florida and director of Mayo Clinic Women's Health, and also medical director of the North American Menopause Society.
Great. Claire.
Hi, I'm Claire Gill. I'm the founder of the National Menopause Foundation and the CEO of the Bone Health and Osteoporosis Foundation.
All right. And a real trooper, by the way, with your cold. I wanted to thank you too. I know I feel sorry for you, but
I look awful. I'm so embarrassed. I feel bad, but thank you. I appreciate it.
No, you don't. You don't. I just, from my voice to yours, we're quite a team right now. So here we go. Deb.
Hi, I'm Deborah Grady. I'm a professor of medicine at UC San Francisco, former director of the Women's Clinic at the San Francisco VA, and also a director of our Women's Health Clinical Research Center at UCSF.
Thank you again. And Paula?
Hi again, I'm Paula Greensmith. I'm the Chief Training Officer for the Black Women's Health Imperative.
All right. And gosh, it looks like it was alphabetical, but our two new folks are with us from the payer community. First, Michelle, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hello, I'm Michelle Rogers. I'm the clinical pharmacy director for IPD Analytics. And I'll just say a little bit about IPD Analytics if those of you that aren't aware of who we are. IPD Analytics is a consulting firm that provides drug intelligence and drug management insights to healthcare organizations. And one of our main roles is to offer formulary insights to payers, and we also track trends across the payer landscape.
I love it when you guys are part of our roundtables because we count on you to be whisperers with the payer community, and you can summarize over a broad number of payers in ways that is very helpful for people to understand what they're thinking and how they do things. So thank you again for joining us.
Thank you.
And not last but not least, John Watkins.
Hi, everyone. John Watkins. I'm the residency program director in pharmacy at Premier Blue Cross. We are a Blue Plan in Washington and Alaska. And I can say that we listen quite carefully to what we hear from IPD Analytics. So we appreciate that. In addition to ICER, it's one of the places that we get pipeline information from.
Great. Chantel, by the way, I did see your comment, and we will get to that in just I think there's a point at which it'll be better to address what you wanted to talk about. So hang on to that, but we won't forget. All right. So I want to step back, and I guess I'll start with the clinical experts to a certain extent. So let's just assume for the sake of argument that fezolinetant is approved February next year. What is the role of clinical experts and the societies that exist out there to put out statements, to have guidelines ready to go when this new treatment option is ready? Or do they say, oh, we got to wait a few years and get better data, and let's just let doctors and patients sort it out for themselves in the short term. Maybe we'll write a few loose op-eds. What should the role be of the organized, if you will, elements of the clinical expert community be when something like fezolinetant comes into use? Stephanie, go ahead.
That's a great question. Hadn't thought about it like that until you just asked that question. But I think organizations or societies like the North American Menopause Society do have a role in helping members and clinicians at large figure out how to put this in context. We don't have a whole lot of data or context in which to frame it right now. And I think there will be more to come, but I don't think we can necessarily afford to wait 4 or 5 years or more to be able to say what we do with this drug. Like, when should it be used? When should it not be used, et cetera. So I do think we have a role there. Having said that, and having just published our 2022 hormone therapy position statement, which, takes about 18 months to get out, it's not going to be something that's going to come tomorrow, right? So I do think there's a role, but it's not going to be immediate.
And just for a little bit of context before I go to Deb on this, John, you've been doing, P&T work at a payer for a long time. Tell them what happens when a new drug gets, what happens with your staff when they start to look, for the clinical guidelines or statements, like what's going to happen in February if fezolinetan's approved? What are they going to do?
Sure, and actually, we already are preparing for that. It is on the February P&T agenda, so we'll be dealing with it just about at that point. Obviously, we would like to know the pricing, depending on when the actual approval occurs, whether it's, as you all no doubt know, PDUFA dates are and stop for FDA, but they sometimes will release a drug sooner than that. So I'm guessing we may or may not know pricing, but we are putting together utilization management criteria. And I think one of the main things we can contribute to this discussion is the manufacturer will drive a lot of this by how you price it. So if you price it toward the lower end of what we've been talking about, it's more likely that payers will be able to say, yeah, I really think this needs to be a shared decision. I can't make that from where I sit. My ideal would be that the patient and their doctor or whoever their provider is would make that decision together. But the more expensive it gets, the more payers are going to be pressured to put more restrictive criteria on it.
All right. Somebody's got a very active cat in the background. I'm not sure if that was you, John, or not.
That's mine. I'm going to go take care of her. I'll be right back.
I'm sorry. Well, I tried to prompt you because what I was thinking, that's a very important perspective. And my knowledge of how that process works is that they will have a template in which they will cut and paste whatever the latest guideline is about hormone therapy, about if there's anything about this drug. And because they really turn to the clinical expert community and feel that that's almost their bedrock. A lot of people complain about insurers and how they sometimes do or don't do things. But it is interesting when a new drug comes in, especially if it's going to shake up the paradigm of what comes first or what comes second and who's eligible for this versus that. That there is a tension for the clinical expert community because they want to be judicious, they want to be thoughtful, they have a consensus approach, et cetera, et cetera. But the longer that takes, they're leaving a vacuum in which insurers and others will be kind of scrambling and looking for that input. And they may get very different input from different experts. So it really can be a kind of helter-skelter kind of approach. Deb, I'm sorry, though, I didn't give you a chance to come in on this if you wanted to. Your view on...
I don't really have much to add. I mean, I think the organizations like NAMS does have a responsibility to sort of synthesize the evidence and make clinical recommendations, but they can't really do that if there's nothing published. So I don't know, if this gets approved in February and still nothing is published, I don't know, I wouldn't know where to go with it as a clinician. And,
So
I mean, there's always people who are enthusiastic about new drugs and others who are wary of new drugs,
right,
and how that'll all play out. I don't know.
Right. So patient experts, representatives, how does that sound to you? I mean, shared decision-making is this, ideal end goal, if you will. But what I just painted to a certain extent was the possibility that at least in the early months, it's going to be pretty loosey-goosey as far as what evidence is out there. There won't be any authoritative guidelines, at least for a while. Individual clinical experts may have different views of the evidence. Is that the way it should be? Or, I mean, what do you think is the right way for the system to handle the introduction of a drug like fezolinetant. Claire, go ahead.
Yeah, I would say from a patient perspective, I think as we think about drugs that are approved by the FDA, then we assume that it's gone through some rigorous review, and therefore comes out with whatever the recommendation is from the FDA. And that's everything from, safety, efficacy, whatever, or it has a black box on it, right? And then, those things come out, and then the clinician and the patient needs to talk through what the risk benefit is of that new treatment. And I harp on this a lot, but I'm sort of like, well, then when this drug comes out with the FDA approval for whatever it is, until the medical societies do evaluate and do the additional studies, which they're going to do to determine themselves what their ongoing recommendation is, I would imagine that it's going to be a sort of a slow burn versus millions of women are going to go on this drug immediately, and we don't know what's going to happen to them because the data isn't there. Well, that's not going to happen because your clinicians have just told you they don't really know yet what they would do, and they're probably going to wait for more data to be available. So I sort of see then this what should the process be? The process should be that the drug comes onto the market, and then as at whatever price is set and whatever is going to be covered, kind of thing, and then the patients and the clinicians decide whether or not, based on what the FDA approval said, is it worth the risk of them trying it now or waiting to see what becomes more effective, what happens down the line. So I think that system would take care of itself, which always makes me wonder then, as I've gone through this with bone and now doing it with with this, what's the ultimate purpose of this when we don't have the data, and we said you're asking this group to vote based on there's nothing available for them to actually really make a decision, as they've already said. Well, I'm sort of assuming it means this, and so therefore I'm going to do this, and I get, right, there's going to be an economic impact, but it's not like drug pricing doesn't change, right? So the market will determine whether or not that price works or not, whatever it's set at. And so I don't know what the I guess I'm still struggling with what this process is really for, because the clinical societies are going to do their own tests, come up with their own clinical guidelines. They're going to, do the same review of the published data when it's published that you guys have looked at, previously, or that this group has looked at it previously. So I'm not so sure what the rush to efficacy and economic value is for a drug that hasn't come on the market yet. I guess as a consumer and as a patient, I'm still struggling with that. Whereas I figure, like, again, down the road, I want to have access to new treatments. I want to be able to make that decision with my clinician. And then even, again, as we have this policy discussion, and when I thought policy, I was thinking, okay, what are we telling the government that we need to do about women's health and this drug and stuff? But if we're talking about what should the step therapy be for this drug before it comes on the market, I don't feel comfortable that this group is the people who decide that. I want the clinical societies to do the research and figure it out, and then come back with recommendations, and then have that conversation with patients.
No, I understand.
From a patient perspective, Paula, what do you think?
Yeah.
I have the same concerns. And again, I'm coming from the perspective of a community of people that we were so painfully reminded of during this, after, the aftermath of COVID and the vaccines. I'm from a community of people that are still talking about the Tuskegee, experiment, and how Black people are not a part of clinical trials. And so there's so much information that's not available to us. So there are going to be more and more questions that I haven't gotten from this process today. I don't feel have been addressed, or that the information is there. There's enough evidence out there that of the benefit of such a drug for instance, communities of color, women, Black women. And so I think that if you're asking, I guess that if the question is, what should the process be? The simplest way to say it is that a lot more information, absolutely a lot more information. But a lot of what Claire just described needs to needs to become available. That process needs to happen and become available to be able to answer questions, and for the clinicians to really be able to provide enough information for the right kinds of questions to be answered, and for that shared decision-making process to take place. At this juncture, it doesn't feel to me like there's enough information available for all of the necessary parts to happen. I think Claire outlined that very well for me.
Right. So, and yeah, as I said before, there's absolutely a tension, and that's partly why we do have these meetings now, because as John said, insurers around the country are already starting their planning and their documents on this very issue. Will they cover it? How will they cover it? And when they go to talk to the manufacturer, who in our country has the power, if you will, to set their own price, how will that influence their thinking around what a fair price is? And, you know, at some point, as John said, depending on where that price gets set, you may see different approaches to coverage by different insurers. And is that fair? So that's kind of a lot of what we're trying to talk through. And I know it may seem premature, but boy, we'll talk in a bit about step therapy and whether that's the right thing to do from a clinical perspective or from a patient's perspective, given the uncertainty. And that, you know, that kind of just general discussion around how the evidence will be interpreted, I think helps, partly to just ground people also in an ability to hear from patients, because to be fair, insurers have the job, they have to act individually. They can't work together because that would be a collusion antitrust problem. And they have to look at a lot of different treatments, not just drugs, and they don't have the time to get into the evidence to the degree that we do. They don't have time, honestly, to hear from patients and clinical experts to the degree that we do. So it's a chance to make sure that we provide a really broad perspective. And John can tell you stories of how he's heard things in these meetings that have influenced the way that, you know, at least one insurance company covers things. So I think we're here for a lot of those different purposes. But I hear what you're saying about the general approach. I want to ask you that Chantel actually. Okay, Claire, let me come back to you, but then I have a question for Chantel about how the company will engage with patients and clinicians. Go ahead, Claire. Oh, Claire, did you have your hand up?
I did. I thought you wanted to go to Chantel first.
Oh, well, unless you wanted to come back on something very specific.
No, I just wanted to ask a little bit about that. You know, what you just said, and when we talk about what the system should be, and how we go about the process, and we're saying the strains that are on this process now, but we're sort of making do with what's there, right, and with what's available and that kind of stuff. I think that's part of the problem, as I see it, from what's going on with our healthcare system, and sort of, you know, looking at alternatives to find a way that actually makes sense and will get us where we want to be. You know, it's sort of like when we say, like, especially as a policy roundtable, right? I can't tell you how many times, as a patient advocate, I'm on Capitol Hill talking about something on the legislation that's going to be done, and they're saying, "Well, we know it's not right, but we're gonna pass it, and then we'll go back and fix it, right?" And then great, but the amount of time and money and energy that is wasted to get at a results that's not going to fix the problem, but it's going to get something out there. They can, you know, say it where, you know, hey, look, we passed legislation, and then we'll go back and actually try to make it right for patients, and then we have to fight for that all over again. That's kind of, I feel like this is just another one of those processes where we know that it's not right, right? We've talked about the tension of it's not quite right, but we're going to do it anyway, and then hopefully down the line, we'll plug in numbers into the economic model once we get the data, and we'll do all these kind of stuff, and then eventually make itself right. Is that equation, am I making sense?
Well, I think the question is whether we can make some advance on the current situation by having an independent review of the evidence and the ability to hear from patients and clinical experts to help inform the decisions that we might all say it's not ideal, but the decisions are going to be made over the next couple of months about what to do with this drug. And so that's where we're do
the same. Like, I participated in the FDA review too. So they take the comment, you know, they seek out patient groups. We have to comment on the FDA, right, you know, kind of stuff, whatever. So they're doing that through that review process too. So I don't know. Anyway,
but they are not. Their job is officially not to talk about the price or the insurance coverage. So that's that's part of the difference of what they do versus what we do. John, go ahead.
Yeah, and they do talk about the evidence, but the public doesn't see that unless they're an FDA advisory committee junkie that just tunes into all this stuff. But we've talked about, I'm seeing three basic buckets of information here. There's what we know, there's what we know we don't know, and there's what we don't know we don't know. The FDA process, which drives what the manufacturer will be able to advertise, focuses on what we do know, and it doesn't ever highlight what the missing information is. And that, coupled with the fact that it uses the term significant in a way that gives a false impression to non-statisticians. And I really appreciate Claire and Paula, your being here. One thing that ICER does for us that Steve was alluding to is to give us the opportunity to hear from you. I would love to do that, but I don't have budget for it.
Yeah. So let me turn to Chantel then. Chantel, part of the system, quote unquote, or the way that things work, is that the day that the FDA will approve this, you have the ability to advertise directly to patients and to clinicians. And I want to tell a short story, and by illusion, you'll get where I'm headed with this. But, you know, we looked at a drug a while ago that was a new treatment for people with high cholesterol. And it was an alternative, a new way to treat it other than statins, which are, most doctors would tell you, are underprescribed. They're great drugs. We should be finding more people and treating more people with statins. They have been out there for a long time, and there's lots of evidence that some patients can have side effects, some of them minor, most of them minor, et cetera, et cetera. And so the advertising that came out for this new drug, and this was to clinicians first, was it was a picture of a doctor hacking his way through a jungle. And the jungle was patient concerns about side effects from statins. And it said, cut your way through that jungle of patient concerns and use something new. So you don't have to work with your patient and talk to them about their concerns about side effects and get them on this other drug. You can just divert to something new that doesn't have that problem. And I wonder, you probably don't work in the direct-to-consumer or direct-to-clinician advertising part of your company, but how do you think you will communicate and advertise the niche that this drug you feel will and should play? How do you frame that within the general instinct from a lot of clinical experts that hormonal replacement therapy or hormone therapy might be a better option? How are you going to manage that?
Thanks, Steve. I can't comment on what the company that you had shared the example of, but what I can tell you is we will have a very patient-centered approach. I mentioned in my public comments that we've engaged with over 8,000 women that experience vasomotor symptoms to understand what resonates with them. And that's how we'll approach this in a very responsible way. And that's something we take very seriously. And we've demonstrated that with other products that we have on the market.
So just to play devil's advocate again, the best way for you guys to have a bigger market is to convince a lot of women not to take hormone treatment, but to use this instead. Let me pitch it back to the clinical experts. Yeah. How are you going to manage? How do you think the shared decision-making should work? And what do you anticipate about the way that this drug will be kind of framed, both by you and perhaps by advertising?
You know, given the lack of data, I don't really know. If we assume that the results that the ICER staff have provided hold up with publication, I think there will be a role for this medication in women who want to avoid hormone therapy, whether that's rational or not. And to some extent, that's not a good thing, because I think there are other benefits to hormone therapy, and that the dangers are way overestimated in the press. So I think that'll be one approach. And the other approach will probably be a Hail Mary. That is, if you have a patient who you've tried let's say, who has breast cancer or something, and you've tried some of the other medications that are typically used for menopausal symptoms, then you'll try this drug. Because, we're talking about symptoms. If the drug, if you give it to a patient, the patient feels a whole lot better, fine. If they don't, they can stop. So there's no evidence, at least as far as I can see, although there's skimpy evidence, that there's any lasting, adverse effects associated with this.
Okay, thank you. Stephanie, what do you think?
I still think it's going to be a little bit of a free for all initially, because we don't have any long-term data, and there's no way to really guide clinicians. And I think they're going to fall back on many of the practicing clinicians now learned what they know about menopause management in the aftermath of the WHI, and they never really bothered to come back around and learn the rest of the story. And so we have a group of clinicians that are really not educated, and that's been demonstrated well across all specialties, even OBGYNs. They're not well educated on menopause management. So they're going to be listening to their patients who are going to be coming into the office and demanding some sort of therapy. And probably the patient's going to be driving the conversation about, I want to use this or I want to use that.
So how do you think, I'm just curious from your own clinical, from where you sit as a clinician, and again, you are not the typical clinician who will be answering these kinds of questions, the primary care doctor, general, but a patient comes in saying, I heard there's a new treatment option. What do you think? How do you engage them around that treatment versus hormonal treatment versus other options?
Are you asking me what my stepwise approach would be?
Yeah, you personally. I mean, in general, I know each patient's going to be different, but how do you think you're going to frame it?
I would say that there's still a lot we don't know about this drug. It does look promising for some women, especially those who can't or don't want to use hormone therapy. But for those who can use hormone therapy, I would probably start there because we have a lot more data on it. And it also depends on the patient. Is it just hot flashes, or is it hot flashes and bone concerns and vaginal dryness and I'm not sleeping at night and my mood is terrible? And if all of those are the case, which I can promise you that most women don't have just one symptom, then hormone therapy would probably be the best first option for many of those women. As we've talked about, these are mostly healthy women who are in their 50s. But for women who have breast cancer, for example, or just had a clot, or have at high risk or have heart disease, I think it's a very viable option.
Okay. Maybe as a former primary care doctor, I will say that in my own general experience, not just my own as a clinician, but as others, it's especially in a busy day, the time it takes to dissuade a patient about potential side effects of something that they've heard about or read about is a tough challenge in a busy day when you have another treatment option where all you have to do is tick a box and write something else, versus taking the time to say, where did you hear that? What is your understanding? Well, here's what I see, and here's why, many doctors think that this is a better way to start. Unless there is a formal guideline from your society or something that really kind of pushes you in that direction, it can be a tough situation for a doctor or a nurse practitioner.
100% right. And our consultations are an hour long for that reason.
Yeah, that is a luxury most don't have.
Exactly.
Steve, may I respond to the assertion regarding replacing HT?
Yes, please.
That is not at all the intent that Astellas has for this product. We believe that HT has a place in therapy. I think the big challenge that everyone faces today, and Stephanie has referred to this, that there are so many women who can't or don't want to take hormone replacement therapy. And in that situation, other alternatives are really needed because women are suffering right now. So the answer is no, we don't intend to say that this drug replaces all hormone therapy. That would not be responsible.
No, I wasn't implying that. No, I don't think anybody, and I think the interesting zone is the ones that we say don't want to. What does that mean to a clinician, to a patient? We all agree that shared decision-making is the right way to go, but we all also know that patients can get information or have ideas, and that part of the job of a clinician is to work with that and maybe help them see it from a different perspective. But that's going to be part of, because we're talking about a lot of women who might not want to take hormonal therapy, especially if, and I'm not saying that it will, but if that other company's example is something that we see in the marketplace, it's not impossible that the marketing will be such that it will encourage doctors and women to take that non-hormonal option, because why? There are risks, there are side effects. Try the new thing. Claire,
Well,
now
I mean, it's hard to know what's going to happen in the short term, but we need some optional, some different effective treatments other than hormone therapy for vasomotor symptoms. And if you look a couple of years down the road, if we've got accumulating safety data, accumulating data on efficacy, this would be a great option.
Right. We'll talk about the timing of this too. Yes, Claire, please.
I just wanted to say that although we're becoming more advocates for ourselves, women going to the hospital, going to the doctor's office, I would still say a majority of women are going to go by the lead of what their clinician says. And if the clinician mentions something or says it to them, by the time they're getting to it, Dr. Fabian, who is, a specialist on it, you're going to get the most informed, self-advocating woman possibly, right? Because the rest of the women are just going to, like you said, clinicians who don't know about it. So I don't think there's going to be this rush of women saying, because they saw an advertisement that says, hey, what about this? What about this? What about this? And I consider myself, and as you've all probably seen, a pretty advocating woman and self-assured to go into it. And for a chronic disease I have, I never went into my clinician and said, hey, I saw this and I think I want to know about that drug. We had the conversation about, well, what's possible? And then he told me the risk and benefits of what was possible. And then I said, well, what do you recommend and why? And then I took the information home, kind of stuff. And that's what I said. I think we're assuming sometimes that, women are just going to see advertisement and go rushing in and demanding a drug. I don't think that's the case, even for the most demanding. And when we think about particularly this stage with menopause, as we said, so many women aren't getting treated, a whole lot of them because they don't want to be treated, right? A whole lot of them because they don't know that there's any other option other than there's something they've heard negatively about. And they don't ask, and their doctor doesn't tell them or discuss it with them at all. So some of that worry about, what might happen if the women go into do that, I think that might be a little too soon.
Well, I think you'd agree. We all, in a sense, would like the fact that if there is a new treatment option, it might stimulate more women to ask their doctor about potential treatment options. If they've been sitting on the sidelines, suffering, and haven't even talked about it, maybe it will be a good prompt. The question is, how do they come into that conversation, and how do clinicians manage it to, in a sense, get the true goals of shared decision-making, not too influenced? Because again, this is historically what's happened, is that there are no companies out there that are going to redouble their advertising around hormone replacement therapy because it's a very inexpensive drug and they're unlikely to put. So what we are likely to see are more ads for the new drug, driving more conversations. And then again, the question is, how do women understand the trade-offs that they face, and how do doctors lead them through that kind of question? So
that faces in all kinds of things. Like there's, if there's the new drugs on, osteoporosis and bone, that didn't stimulate lots of women running in to say, I want the thing. We know, what drugs they're generally on, and it's not the newer drugs, it's the older ones. So there is still the conversation being had. They're getting the generic and the conversations being had. I still think it's going to be the clinicians who are going to lead, where a woman saying, I'm experiencing all these things, these symptoms or whatever. If she mentions it, and if he says it, the clinician will likely say, well, then we can put you on hormone replacement therapy, and they'll say no. Yeah. And then maybe there's a conversation, well, there's other options. That's likely how it's going to happen, more than someone sees an advertisement and goes rushing in, unless they are super informed and they're seeking out a specialist. And if they're seeking out a specialist, then they have done their homework and they want to know what the possibilities are.
Stephanie, I think you wanted to say something.
Yeah. But what I'm saying, I hear you, but you don't see blogs all over the place now on bone therapies. You see blogs all over the place now on menopausal hormone therapies and menopause treatments. So there is a groundswell of women talking about this now, which is a great thing. but they're also demanding therapies and options for management of their symptoms. And that's what's driving a lot of sketchy stuff going on right now in terms of the menopause market, which is, by the way, a $660 billion market. So there's all kinds of startups that are trying to fill this vacuum that has been created. So this is going to partially fill that void. And I promise you, it's going to get a lot of attention from women and not just providers.
Paula.
I agree. I think that, first of all, I see both sides of this. As much as I know there are so many people that are just so averse to any kind of therapies and are going to ask for, if they are required or if it's presented to them, they're going to need a lot of information to be able to actually fully engage in shared decision making. So first, I think that the clinicians have to be informed enough for them to be able to really engage in true shared decision making with the right information to do so. But I also see the other side of it. I have friends and relatives that every drug they see, every commercial, it's like, oh, is that something that's going to help me? And they go in and request that, or request more information about it. So what I would like to see is that shared decision-making part be really, really enhanced with enough information for the doctors to really say, listen, these are the options available to you, and let's talk through those. Now, I agree. I recognize that what Stephanie just described, that 1 hour for that consultation about that is not often the case. And I also recognize there's another element, and that is there are a lot of people with physicians, a lot of the people we work with have physicians that they don't have that kind of relationship with. They don't have that trusting relationship with some of them. And so I think there's a lot that has to happen for true shared and decision-making process to happen and really be beneficial. But I see both sides of it. And I wanted to make sure I mentioned that part of people seeing the commercial and going in and asking for it is real. It's real. I hear it, and I'd like to see us just really provide what everybody needs to really be fully engaged, or to really promote and support the full engagement of shared decision-making. And that's a lot of information. And actually some other parts that, Stephanie described, the time to be able to engage in that with patients is another big part, and building just the time it takes to build that trusting relationship for it to even be beneficial.
Claire or Paula, do you guys feel like your organizations would put out a guidance for patients on this treatment when it's launched? There won't be a clinical specialty guideline yet to fill that gap that Paula, you just pointed out. Does your own organization have a role, or is it somebody else's job to try to do that?
I think we think it's others' roles, but that is a part of what we do, because remember, our organization is centered on education, advocacy. Right. So yes, we do that. We do education, advocacy, and programming to fill the gap, to create better health outcomes for Black women. And so with that as our mission, yes, we do that. And we would do that with respect to things such as this, therapies that we would like for women to really look at to mitigate this normalization of suffering.
Right.
So yes, from our perspective, yes. Now, how we do that moves into our programming.
Yeah.
And yes, we do look at those kinds of things, and we do that.
Same here. I think we would provide information about it as we would for all FDA approved treatments. We would not make recommendations, obviously. We would just direct people to the information that's available about it, and then again, tell them to discuss it with their doctors, probably send them to NAMS, with links to that kind of stuff, so that they have all of the information and provide the education. But, any FDA approved treatment that's available, we will, again, as Paula said, try to educate patients on what's available and be able to give them the tools and resources they need to go in and think about and have the conversation with their clinician. But it's always, you need to have this conversation with a clinician.
Right. By the way, if anybody wants an eye-opening way to think about this world, Stephanie, you kind of mentioned blogs, but if you put into YouTube menopause symptoms, you will get an amazing gamut of fascinating characters doing interesting things, diagrams of every part of the neuroadrenal system, testimonials, every single kind of supplement, herbal, vitamins, etc. So if I'm a woman trying to figure this out, boy, I sure hope I can find either a clinician that I can have a real conversation with or a trusted patient group, in the near term, because the noise around these issues, if you will, out there in social media is just intense right now.
Lots of misinformation and lots of money being thrown in it, which complicates it.
Yeah. All right. I want to pivot to some of the details of how insurers will be writing their coverage policies in the next weeks to months. But before that, I did want to offer Chantel the chance to comment back on something that came up around moonlight. And I'm not sure there is a perfect time for this, but Chantel, why don't you go ahead?
Thank you. So just a couple of things just to ground everyone in the reason that all of the data is not out there yet. So when we complete our studies, we immediately filed our NDA with the FDA, very short time period. And the review is a 6-month review. So unlike our traditional year-long review, we would have much more time to get those publications out there. That said, we were very aggressive. And as I mentioned earlier, our 3 US trials are currently under review. And it is our intent and our desire that those be published before we have regulatory approval. Obviously, we don't control that. We're having those discussions right now and providing information to help facilitate that process. So that's what the US trials. I want to clarify Moonlight so that everybody understands there are 2 Moonlight trials. There is Moonlight 1 and there's Moonlight 3. Let me set Moonlight 3 aside, but just say Moonlight 3 was a long-term safety study, only a 52-week safety study that we did disclose in a press release in September that will ultimately be published. It was not an efficacy study. It did look at 30 milligrams, and that will be disclosed. Moonlight 1, which was the one that kept coming up this morning, is a study that was 12 weeks to assess efficacy, but actually a 24-week to assess long-term safety. We, as a company, made a decision to disclose the 12-week safety data, the 12-week efficacy data before the study was complete. So I just want to make sure that's clear. Typically, a company will wait till your study is complete and you have a final study report and then disclose that information. We thought it was relevant, and that is that we disclosed that the 30 milligram study did not show a difference from placebo, as opposed to holding that data to the 24-week. Had we done that, we just completed that CSR weeks ago. So that would have meant we would have held that data until now, but we chose actually to disclose that data before the study was complete. I also wanted to be clear that in working with the agencies, both FDA and EMA, we've done a lot of dose finding. They have all of that data. Both the FDA and EMA agreed with us that the phase 3 is a 45 milligram dose. They looked at all of the data. So the fact that we didn't show efficacy in the 30 milligram dose, the data is actually consistent with all of our other studies. One other point that I would like to point out, which we've also publicly disclosed in that Moonlight trial, is there was a much higher placebo response in that trial than any of our other studies. Now, many of you have been PIs before, and you know that periodically that happens. We're trying to understand that. But if you just look at the efficacy data, it is consistent. There was a suggestion this morning.
Chantel, I'm sorry. I know that this is important, but if you can wrap up, because I want to move on to the policy aspects.
There was a suggestion this morning that perhaps the 30 milligram was less efficacious than placebo. I will tell you that that is not correct. And now that we have our complete study report, we will look to publish this data. As many of you know, it will be difficult to get this accepted at the Congress because it is negative trial results. But that said, we are 100% committed to publishing the data, and we will do so.
Okay. Thank you. And I'm not going to come back or try to ask further questions. I know that was a fair amount of the conversation this morning. Okay, so let's pivot to the way that insurers are now meeting to put pen to paper on the way that they will cover this if it is approved by the FDA. And Michelle, let me come to you first on this. The usual way is for them to say, okay, what does the FDA label read like? What does the clinical trial eligibility look like? What do any clinical society guidelines have to say? Anything else in that first kind of packet of information that they look at, or any comments on how they put those 3 pieces together from your experience?
Yeah, I think that the challenge is that oftentimes there's limited data when they have to make these decisions like this, where there's not published data. But they'll use a combination of those. And, unfortunately, the society guidelines, we'll look at what the society guidelines say now. So unfortunately, right now we don't have fezolinetant in the guidelines. So they're going to look at, okay, what do the society say about hormone therapy? But they're also going to look at non-hormonal therapies too, because there's several societies that do suggest that in patients that don't want to take hormone therapies or those that can't, that the non-hormonal therapies may be effective. So those are the things that payers, I think, are going to look at. And again, just to reiterate what John said, how those criteria, what those criteria look like is really going to be dependent on what the price is. And I think, there are going to be very restrictive payers or restrictive formularies that may, restrict it to just a certain population. Or, or it could be that there could be multiple steps.
Right. And since we don't know the price yet, we're going to have to kind of deal with a range of possibilities of how payers will think about applying some of these factors to their coverage as we go through it. But let's go through the way that a usual coverage policy would look. It'll start with the age for which it's approved. Now, the clinical trial eligibility criteria was ages 40 to 65. So the standard insurer will say this drug is approved for women ages 40 to 65. Even if the FDA label doesn't say that, which it may or may not, insurers will tend to use the clinical trial data to kind of fill in the gaps. So clinical experts, would that raise any issues for you, 40 to 65? Would there be obvious patients for whom fezolinetant should be a consideration beyond that age range? Is that age range too broad?
I think it's fine, but again, those women who are 40 that don't have a reason that they can't use estrogen should be using estrogen. And I think we need to have some clarity about that.
All right, I will come to step therapy in a very short
I think
time.
those age ranges are also just arbitrary. Where'd you get
Agreed.
those?
Yeah,
that
they
was the
are.
clinical trial, right? Right.
I mean, yeah, clinical trial, you put people in a clinical trial because of things to do with a clinical
Yeah.
trial, not things to do with how they ought to be treated in real life. So, I mean, there are 70-year-olds out there, that's another group of people in whom you might want to start avoiding hormone therapy because that's where the baseline risks of coronary disease and stroke begin to be, more substantial, and increasing those even a small amount can be important. So I think such a drug might be used in older women, rationally used in older women.
Yeah, you're right.
Okay. That's Claire, I'm not going to do this more than once, but this is the kind of thing that we get out of these conversations that I actually think enrich the thinking of everybody as they come to the early coverage issues around here. Okay, so here's an even trickier part. We know that these trials focused on women with quote unquote moderate to severe vasomotor symptoms. Now, an insurer can either leave that out entirely and say it's covered for women with vasomotor symptoms, or they can leave that exact language in there and say moderate to severe and let the doctor decide what that means. Or they can ask the doctor to check a box saying that they have moderate to severe, or they can come up with a definition of moderate to severe. And the clinical trial said a minimum of 7 to 8 moderate to severe hot flashes per day, or 50 to 60 per week. Now, again, this is where, as I think John and Michelle mentioned, depending on the price and the sense of whether the price is fair or low enough or whatever you want to say, insurers might take different approaches to how tightly they use language to kind of define the population for which the drug could be used. But I want to kind of go around the horn and start with Michelle or John. What's your gut? And I know it may all depend on whether the price is, A, B, or C. But what's your guess? Do you think they will try to define what moderate to severe hot flashes? Will they try to come up with some threshold for severity here?
I don't believe so. Oh, sorry, John.
I think some people may, again, as the usual cliche, if you see one payer, you've seen one payer. We would basically, again, depending on the price constraints, if it's priced toward the lower end, I would be advising that we look at how clinically reasonable are the entry criteria in the study. Some criteria are there simply to get a nice clean box for a trial so that you don't end up with messy patients that will get your results invalidated. Others are there for a real reason. Like with the age criterion, is there a reason to think that on either side of that you should allow or not allow? So again, the lower the price, the more likely we are to be generous and less specific.
Michelle?
I agree with John. However, I don't think payers would be so specific on defining what moderate to severe are. So they may restrict it to moderate to severe, but they won't go as far as defining it like the clinical trial, because like we said earlier today, that's so hard. It's subjective. It's very hard to know, how do you define moderate to severe? So I think that payers may restrict it to that moderate to severe population, but they won't define what that is. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, given that this drug will be prescribed by a lot of primary care doctors, would they put it through prior auth though and require attestation that the patient has moderate to severe? Is that what you're saying, Michelle?
I think I think based on the price, they might use that as a criteria. But again, I think it just depends again how this drug is priced. If it's really high, they may do that. But like John said, we use clinical criteria, or payers use clinical criteria from or inclusion exclusion criteria from clinical trials all the time, especially for very high cost drugs when we really need to limit the population. And that's one thing I did want to say is the other thing that we're going to struggle here, or payers are going to struggle with, is it's a big population of women.
Right.
So that's something that we need to think about. And if it comes that the drug will be very expensive, we kind of have to think about, narrowing that population. But again, depending on price.
I have to point out that this going after the clinical trial criteria is a little bit nuts. And the reason it is because these are the FDA's criteria. All the companies do the trials with this moderate to severe, 12 weeks, double, 2 outcomes. You got to meet it at 4 weeks and 12 weeks. And the FDA developed these about 40 years ago because they didn't want women with mild symptoms taking hormone therapy when we knew it could cause endometrial cancer and so forth. So these are really old, really anachronistic, and probably don't really have anything much to do with who should be taking this drug. I mean, personally, I think you ought to ask a woman if she's got moderate to severe hot flushes that bother her enough that she should take a medicine.
Yeah.
Do we do this with stuff like, I don't know, well, okay, maybe sumatriptan is a good example. You got to justify its
Sumatriptan
significance.
is a very good example. And they do have thresholds for number of headaches per month that and that comes from the clinical trials, even the definition of episodic versus chronic migraine.
But that's
So
isn't that entirely based on the cost of the triptans? I mean, they're effective, they're pretty safe.
It's partly because it also depends on whether plans feel that there are other alternatives that are usually less expensive that could be as effective. So we're coming to that very shortly.
That's a good point in terms of, are there other drugs? Yeah.
Right. So we'll come to that. Can I ask also about sleep symptoms? We've been talking about vasomotor symptoms, hot flashes, and we really didn't talk about the effect of this drug on sleep. But would a woman who came in with sleep problems interrelated to this, I mean, how should that affect, if at all, insurance coverage? Should that be a criterion that would allow you to give fezolinetant a shot or not?
I don't think you're going to find any women coming in saying, I don't have hot flashes, I don't have night sweats, I just can't sleep, and that you should then attribute that to menopause. That's some sort of sleep disorder that isn't menopause related. The vast majority of women will tell you, and it may not be true because some studies have shown that these are not correlated, that is, severe hot flashes at night and sweats, which then awake the woman from sleep. But it probably happens. And so is it worth treating, if that's a severe problem, is it worth treating that with something that cures the hot flashes? Yeah, probably. Okay. I doubt if it's as good as hormone therapy for that reason, but I would not try it.
Okay, let's enter the troubled waters of step therapy here. We've got two set of options. I'm sorry, Alan, I don't, please do. All right, I'm going to read this in a second, Alan. Let me see if I can get my question out first, and I'll read this. We've got menopausal hormone treatment. We have SSRIs that are largely off-label. We have been talking about, we're not even really sure how many women use them, but they are being used by clinicians and women. So they are all cheaper. They're going to be cheaper than this drug. No matter what we think the price might be, there's essentially no chance that it will be less expensive or equally expensive to these other alternatives. So is it reasonable for a health insurer to ask a clinician, let's say, to document that the patient is not a suitable candidate for MHT before being given insurance coverage for a drug that could cost $5,000, $6,000, $10,000 a year? Should a clinician have to do that to obtain coverage for a patient?
How do you define not a suitable candidate?
Well, you could come up with a long list of criteria and make the clinician walk through that, or you could leave it up to them as my judgment is that it's not clinically suitable or appropriate for this patient, yes or no. But it's, in a sense, forcing them to answer that question as part of the process. John, let me just give you a chance to chime in. This is very standard operating procedure for a relatively expensive new drug where there is a cheaper alternative for some patients. What would your instinct be about the way that payers will approach this?
I think a lot of us will, again, look at the pricing. If we are not too worried about the price of it, it's very easy to just accept physician attestation. We cited you were using an example from cholesterol therapy before, and the manufacturers of those drugs lowered the price partly in response to ICER's work, and payers responded by loosening criteria. So at one extreme, I could just say physician attestation, check a box saying you think the patient should get this based on whatever criteria, or you can put more check boxes, or you can require chart notes. So again, depending on how much we dislike pricing, you're probably going to get stricter criteria. This is a drug I would like to see priced moderately, and I would like to be able to just say, talk to the patient in your exam room and you guys come to a conclusion. That would be my ideal world, but unfortunately we have things like gene therapy that we have to pay for too.
All right, so back to Stephanie or Deb. Do you think, how would it be for a clinician? Is it a good thing maybe to steer? Remember, we're not talking about you guys. We're talking about the average primary care doctor out there, the bell curve. Should they actually be encouraged to consider MHT by an insurer and tick that, yes, I've thought about it, but it's not the right option for this patient?
I actually think that would be reasonable because that makes them think through the process a little bit.
I guess I don't feel really very strongly about it, but it's probably not unreasonable. And it might force people to have more of a informed decision-making conversation rather than just allowing them to jump on a new drug.
Chantel, can you comment on this, or is it not appropriate given where you are with the FDA?
I mean, my comment would be that Astellas always believes that a decision on prescribing is between the patient and their prescribing clinician, based on that patient's history, and every patient is going to be different. So, requiring documentation or requiring a physician to think through that is perfectly reasonable from my perspective. We want a patient to be put on the appropriate medication. But there will be times, and we know this, women don't choose therapy, right? Because they're fearful, or they have a family history of breast cancer or whatever else it is. And those are reasonable situations where they should be able to choose.
Right. And again, I hope I'm not overplaying this instrument, but we have a system in which your company has an incentive, your marketing division has an incentive to help women know about the risks and side effects of hormone therapy. That is, your incentive is to drive up awareness of the side effects and downsides of hormone therapy. And it's just the way that it is. That's the way that you will drive.
Why do you say that? We don't have any incentive, and we wouldn't, and we don't as a practice in our company go and really talk about other people's products. We talk about the safety and efficacy of our product, and we'll be very transparent on the safety and the efficacy of our product. But I do not at all anticipate and would not support someone going to bash hormone replacement therapy. As I said earlier, it has a place in therapy. Absolutely.
Right. No, I'm just saying it will be another experiment in whether a company can resist the temptation to highlight and to use lots of different social media and other vehicles, both for clinicians and for patients, to highlight the side effects of a competing therapy. It happens. I'm not saying you guys will, but it is a standard operating procedure of the way that our competitive landscape works. And it's just something we have to be eyes wide open about. Let me ask about off-label SSRIs. That may feel like a different conversation. But again, given that plans know that this has been, to a certain extent, standard of care for some women who cannot or do not want to take hormones, they have been placed on SSRIs. Is there any clinical way that you would imagine it being appropriate for an insurer to say, are they, to ask that question, are they appropriate for an SSRI first, or even to use formal step therapy and say they have to try Prozac 10 milligrams for a month before they would get fezolinetant? Any reaction to that, Deb or Stephanie?
Well, first of all, it would be Brisdell is 7.5 milligrams. So that's the only one that's actually FDA approved for hot flashes.
Right, there is one, that's right.
Yeah, so it would be that one. And no, I would say SSRIs have there a whole host of side effects too. So I would not sure say that somebody had to step through an SSRI to get to this drug. I think that would be a mistake. I think we ought to go off what is the risk benefit profile of each of these. And for many of these, they have a twofer, if you will, right? That are off-label for the management of hot flashes. So the SSRIs would be mood symptoms as well. For example, gabapentin has a side effect of it makes you sleepy, so we might dose it at night and get that effect, where somebody might have migraines too. Oxybutynin, a lot of women have overactive bladder, so we might do double duty with that. So all of these conversations have to have, a discussion of the risks and benefits and how do you capitalize on the benefits while minimizing risks. And this is just another one of those, but I don't think you can say you have to step through one or more drugs to get to it.
And by the way, I think that'll be a real part of an interesting challenge for whatever guideline group does get together to look at this area, to figure out what to do with SSRIs. If fezolinetant is approved, how will the clinical world frame their potential use, both the single on-label and the other off-label options, as you said?
Long-term use of SSRIs, they have side effects too, and long-term side effects. So
yeah. Michelle, have you heard at all or have any perspective on this issue about what plans may do with SSRIs now if fezolinetant comes online?
I mean, I haven't heard anything yet. We haven't had any excuse me, payer discussion at IPD Analytics, but given that they're in the guidelines as potential therapies, and because compendia support off-label use of them, I would suspect that there will be payers that will put that into the criteria. Now, whether or not they'll require it, or it just has to be a physician, attesting that a patient's not a candidate, I think that will depend. But I do think that that's on the table, given that they're currently in the guidelines. I don't know if John. I don't know if John feels the same way.
Thank you. You just raised a great example. excuse me, of why, how complex this is and why I would like to have lighter management of it if I could. These patients, generally, they are middle-aged, they have other things going on, and that's going to determine the drug selection.
John, is your cat in heat?
No, she's an old kitty who thinks she
Aw.
needs to be,
All
needs
right.
attention,
I'm sorry.
and I'm alone in the house, sorry.
No, that's okay. I've had a cat in heat, and it's not a good thing. All right, not an easy thing. Okay, let's move on. Then there's one more big piece of the coverage question that intersects with kind of patient and clinician decision making, and that's around the duration of use and when it would be renewed beyond a certain amount of time. Again, at one end of the spectrum, you just let patients and doctors decide. You use it for 6 months, 12 months, 10 years, totally up to you. You start it, you stop it, doesn't matter. Very frequently with new drugs, especially quote unquote more expensive ones, the initial coverage will be for 6 months, and the doctor will be asked to attest that the patient is getting benefit from it before the plan will continue to cover it. That's one element of this. The other is menopause changes over time, and the vasomotor symptoms change. Should a doctor, in some sense, in combination with insurance coverage, should there be a drug holiday required or requested or considered after a certain amount of time? Or does that make any sense given the diversity of patients and how they're going to be cared for? Because a lot of insurers are going to think, shouldn't the doctor stop this at some point and see if the patient still has hot flashes? Don't just keep this going for 10 years without checking. So let's start with the clinical experts. I mean, as you imagine your own use of this drug, and maybe you do the same thing with hormones today, how would you imagine the right way to think about weaving in a drug holiday?
You know, just from clinical practice, most women occasionally skip doses, occasionally will try a month off, go on vacation, forget to renew it, whatever. But most women who come back for an annual review have missed some therapies, and they know if their symptoms are still there or not. I think, you know, when you think about other therapies, do we necessarily do that with antidepressants? Are you sure you still need the antidepressant? You've been on it 10 years. Maybe we ought to have a drug holiday from that. I think this is putting ridiculous barriers up for the care of menopausal women. And I think this is discriminatory, actually, to say that you would have to come off an effective therapy for X amount of time when you're still having symptoms. I think it's ridiculous. So we don't do that for other drugs. Why would we? I mean, other chronic therapies. Why would we do it for this one?
Let me play devil's advocate. The devil's advocate is because vasomotor symptoms of menopause go away in the vast majority of women after a certain amount of time. It can be 10 years or more, but it's not, and you know, depression, yes, comes and goes too. But here's the other thing, the harm of stopping for a while and having vasomotor symptoms recur and then going back on the drug is less maybe than having depression recur with a drug holiday. I'm not saying that I believe that this is the way that it should be done, but on the other hand, remember the bell curve of primary care doctors out there. Do you want them all to start these drugs and so just keep them going? And so we admit 80-year-old women to the hospital and we look at their drug list and they're on fezolinetant?
True. But you know, I think be careful of what you initiate, because you're going to put so many hoops in place that women and their providers are going to be sort of hamstrung by the whole thing.
I hear you. Right. So the guidelines you don't think will say consider a drug holiday in any way, shape, or form?
Well, what we typically say is your therapy should be reevaluated on a regular basis in the context of your current state of health and your need for the therapy, and the dose should be considered each time. So really, we do suggest rigorous follow-up and reassessment. So the same would be for this one, but I don't think we're going to say at X amount of time, you know, the drug should be stopped.
Okay.
I'm sorry, my computer ran out of battery, but we're talking now about fezolinetant and not hormone therapy?
Correct.
Yes, about fezolinetant.
Yeah, because I mean, I think you also have to be careful not to compare fezolinetant to hormone therapy for all these various things. You know, it's rational to ask a woman perhaps to stop her hormone therapy after a few years to see if her symptoms, because the hormone therapy often just masks the symptoms altogether, and they may be gone, so she can stop, or they may come back. And you also want a woman to stop after 4 or 5 or 6 years, because now she's getting into the age of 60 and whatever.
Right.
But I don't see that same concern for fezolinetant. And what happens with most, you know, if you have a headache and you take a drug for it and then your headache goes away, you're going to stop taking the drug. Why would you take the drug? So I find most women, even with hormone therapy, they just stop after a while because they realize they don't need it anymore.
So I think the perspective that we would want to capture in the report is for payers, fezolinetant is unlikely to completely eliminate vasomotor symptoms. It's likely to reduce them. So the woman will know whether she's still having hot flashes. And it's not like you have to stop the drug to figure out if they will still have them.
Right.
Is that a fair characterization?
Yeah, and I think over time, as her hot flashes get better and the fezolinetant is still probably having some effect, she'll just realize that it's too much. I don't need to be treated for this anymore.
Look, adherence to hot flash therapies is not that good to begin with, including hormone therapy. So most of these women are taking it fairly regularly, but miss doses a lot, and they know whether or not they have symptoms underneath.
Okay, that's helpful. Claire, I'm sorry, you had your hand up for a while. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, that's fine. I was interested in hearing what the experts were saying. I think, as Stephanie said, that the undue burden is a little bit, for that particular thing. And again, I think when you think from a patient side, what would be the appropriate time for that to stop? Well, that's probably going to come from the research that's going to be done after the product's on the market again. So I think setting that now doesn't seem to make any sense. It would be, again, something that would come about naturally, the same way it's, women should start birth control after a certain age and women should stop hormone replacement therapy at a certain age, kind of stuff. I think all of that will come in time, but to set that at the beginning doesn't make any sense.
Yeah. Part of the reason I raise it is because there is a template for new drug coverage that will kind of have each insurer walk through each of these elements. And in a competitive landscape, as much as I painted the incentives darkly, if you will, for the manufacturer and their drive to get more patients, for insurers, there is a certain amount of competitive incentive to be tougher than the next guy and to have very tight restriction, especially if this ends up being what they view as an expensive treatment. Employers have benefit consultants who look at the prior auth criteria of different insurers and will say, you should go with that insurer because they only give a coverage for 3 to 6 months and they're tighter and tougher, et cetera, et cetera. So now, again, that doesn't determine the behavior of payers necessarily, but it's just part of the landscape and why talking about, some of these tensions, I think makes sense. Can I go back to Michelle and John before I turn to the manufacturer to ask some questions about factors that go into their thinking about price? John, you've said at least 2 or 3 times, or Michelle, you did too, depending on whether it seems like it's expensive or if it is expensive or reasonably priced, et cetera. What does that mean to a payer in this context? You've got a lot of potential patients, but we don't know what the uptake will be, but potentially there are a lot of women who could take this. How when they're at the very beginning, what's going to seem like a lot of money to them for this treatment? How are they going to decide, oh, this is a low enough price, we can have loose reins versus, that's high, we should have very tight restrictions? Where's the threshold?
Great
John, you want
question.
to give it a shot?
And that's one where Chantel's folks will basically interact with us. And one of the standard things that payers see is a funnel slide that basically says, this is how many people that have menopausal symptoms, and then this is the subgroup. And finally, at the bottom, here's how many patients per million members we expect that you will see. So we appreciate that information. It helps. And again, it depends on the payer, it depends on the market they're in, what their position is in it. So there's a lot of complexity. Another thing that, by the way, that we haven't touched is people will say, well, why is your Blues criteria different? Why are we different from, say, Blue Cross Blue Shield of Massachusetts? And that one of the answers to that is we also talk to our local experts. And so our local experts may disagree with the local experts in Boston. So that's another wild card factor that goes into that.
That's okay, even though the ones in Boston are right. I understand that that can happen, John.
Absolutely.
Inside joke from a person sitting in Boston. All right. Chantel, I know that you can't tell us what the price will be. You could tell us a range, but you don't have to. There's no obligation, and different companies approach that situation very differently. But can you walk us through what are the factors that you will look at? Like, what does your PowerPoint slide look like internally with the different considerations that are going into, because I know the talking points are always, you're going to think about the value to women in society, but what does it really come down to in terms of the categories? Because what we've seen before, for instance, from Senate investigations of internal slide decks are that they think about what's the feedback going to be from clinical experts at this price point versus that one. Where will we start to get some pain or some pressure back from key opinion leaders? What about patient groups? Where will they start to say, gee, that seems like too high or too low a price? I'm just giving a couple of examples from, again, historical precedents. But from your guys' perspective, can you just explain some of the factors that you consider as you come into this decision about what the launch price will be?
Sure. Thanks, Steve. And I think you've highlighted some of those. So it is true. I'm not able to provide a price. We're still, working and finalizing those plans, and we will have those finalized. We as a company, like you mentioned, really think it should reflect the value that it brings to patients and to healthcare systems, especially when there's a high unmet medical need. We look at things like the novelty, the innovation, the science, the quality and the breadth of the evidence that we have to support that, the clinical benefits that are involved, the economic benefits, if there are economic benefits from the products. I can't comment specifically on the slides that you referenced because I'm not in the commercial organization and I'm not part of those slide presentations and discussions, but it's really all around the value that it brings to patients.
So just again, for people watching the webinar, because it's in the public domain, it's from years ago now, but as you can imagine, they have choices. They have choices. We could price it at this point. Here's what will happen, we think, with our focus groups of payers, with our focus groups of patients and our key opinion leaders. And they don't just think about one price. They think about a range of prices and try to figure out how all these different factors will play out. And their general job, and they would agree, is to try to come up with a price that maximizes the return to their shareholders within a longer term strategic landscape in which they want to be viewed as both innovators but also responsible corporate citizens. Mm-hmm. So it's a complicated process, but John, is there anything about the threshold here between a specialty drug as far as the price point and a non-specialty drug that would drive a lot of decisions differently inside payers?
Yes, and the specifics will vary from payer to payer. Medicare, of course, has $1 per month threshold that is fixed, and I'm guessing a lot of payers probably go with that or something close to it.
Is it still 600? By the way, is it still 600 a month, or is it different now?
I don't know what the number for next year is, but it's a little above that and not too much.
I think it's at 800 now.
Yeah, that sounds about right. I was thinking 7 something, but I didn't want to speak without knowing the right answer. But bottom line is, if you price it at $500 or $600 a month, it's probably going to come in just under that.
Okay.
We've seen situations where a major cut in the price of the drug resulted in its not being a specialty drug anymore.
A quick turn to the patient folks, perhaps. So if this drug is priced at around, let's say, $500 to $600 a month, Our estimate was 500. I mean, we just used 500. I can't even remember why they used 6,000 per year as the price point, but that translates into 500 a month. Some plans will put that on a third tier where they will have a dollar copay out of pocket. And then again, this is largely dependent upon the employer's choice of a different formulary as well. But some patients will have to pay a % of that, perhaps especially if they have a deductible, kind of high deductible situation. Any comments from your perspective on what a reasonable price looks like from a patient view of the world?
I don't. That is not my area of expertise. As I would say, I mean, because what's reasonable for me is not going to be what's reasonable for any other person, right? I can't do that across the board. I will say all therapies are affordable if they're covered by insurance.
Right.
And so I think it just becomes what's the out of pocket. I mean, and again, what's the benefit of the therapy to the patient specifically in their situation? I'm on a chronic medication that costs $80,000 a year. Is it worth it? Most people, you might not think so, but to me, it absolutely is. So I think it really depends on the person. And I think, again, above my pay grade, I think those of you who figure out what is considered reasonable given the things are the ones that have to evaluate it. But for some women who have not had any relief from ongoing symptoms and thought there was no other alternative based on where they were, again, putting a price on that. So I don't know whether 5,000 or 10,000 would be reasonable, right? When you think about what medications actually cost. So,
yeah, that's a fair answer. Paula, anything you'd like to add?
No, I agree. It's going to depend on insurance coverage and the efficacy. I mean, if it's really going to make a difference. And I think those are factors that remain to be seen.
Yeah. Well, I'll cherry pick and answer the question myself that I asked Chantel, because from ICER's perspective, and again, Claire, maybe in some ways a response to some of your earlier questions, part of what we do when we put out our report is to frame a range around which we think a reasonable price could be considered based really on the effects that have been shown for patients. We don't take into consideration how much it costs to build the drug or build the building inside which the drug was discovered. We know that there's a competitive landscape in a lot of different ways, but what we want to say is that if the drug can show that it really helps improve patients' quality of life, you scale that price up. And you don't have to extend life. This drug was not assumed to extend life, but just think about it. We're saying, at some thousands of dollars per year, that's what we're talking about in terms of its ability to, on average, help women with their quality of life. So we hope that that can be one anchor in a conversation around what a fair price is. And then, as you said, a lot of it really from a patient perspective, even though they're paying for their overall health insurance premium like everybody else, and they want that to be affordable for the individual patient, it's what their insurer asked them or their employer asked them to pay out of pocket. Claire?
So my question on that though, Steve, then again is, if the evidence from the previous, from this review is basically saying inconclusive because we don't have the evidence, then how can you, so you're saying you can't yet judge what the effectiveness is, but you're going to set a price for what the effectiveness is. That's the part I don't get.
Well, in a sense, we're saying if the FDA decides that they feel the evidence is adequate to push to move this into clinical practice, then there will be a price. And so what we can do is we do use the evidence from the clinical trials, even though we have a lot of uncertainty about it. If you can say we're kind of pinning the tail on the donkey, we take that clinical trial result or the merged data, and we say, if that's truth, then here's how that relates to a scaled price on the benefits, even though we have a lot of uncertainty around that price. Now, certainly insurers will say, if there's a lot of uncertainty, I should get a discount until they can prove more definitively that they really are that effective. And that is a conversation that I know, again, will be held between the payers and the manufacturer around, nice, you're FDA approved, and nice that this is what the trial says, but I would like a discount because I wouldn't want to wait another year until I really have more confidence that these data are playing out. But the company doesn't have to say yes, they can say no. So that's where the power dynamic in our healthcare system still kind of depends. It just depends. All right. Guys, that was fantastic. I really want to thank you for the different perspectives that we got, not just on the payer kind of considerations, but earlier when we were talking too about the patient education, the clinical guidelines, how all of this will be woven into shared decision-making in the best way. We have a lot that we probably can do to improve the situation. And yet if fezolinetant gets approved, my guess is that we'll still have a lot of problems in terms of getting it right, because it's going to be considered by so many women across such a wide variety of practice settings, et cetera. In the last just few minutes, I'd like to give each of you an opportunity to make a closing statement. And we ask you to try to keep it to one sentence with a judiciously placed semicolon or comma. And think of your last statement in this way, I would encourage you. It can either be something that's already been said by you or somebody else that you just want to make sure echoes in our minds and in the final report. It's that important. Or it could be something that you'd like to actually ask of a stakeholder here at the roundtable, or even more broadly, something that you'd say, please do this going forward, because that will really help make the world a better place for innovation, for access, for affordability, whatever it might be from your perspective. So put something on the table. If you could do this, please do it. Or share a haiku poem with us, whatever is really up your sleeve. So I'm going to go around and let the patients have the last word. Chantel, do you mind if I start with you?
Sure, thank you. I would say patients are waiting. We cannot be dismissive of the impact that VMS has on patients, regardless of the treatment.
Thank you. Bonus points for that being a sentence without even a comma or a semicolon. So that's extra points for that. John Watkins.
Sure. If everyone, all the stakeholders will be responsible and think about the overall impact on cost of care, we can treat patients in the way that is best for each individual based on clinical considerations and still keep the system going.
All right. Thank you very much, John. Michelle?
I just want to say that it's been very enlightening to hear the different perspectives. I think that's so important for each of us to kind of look at it holistically. And I also want to say it's exciting that we're actually talking about a new therapy in women's health. It's been dry for a very long time, and it's exciting.
Great. Thanks a lot. Stephanie?
Choices are good, but they do need to be effective, and we clearly have a need for additional research on this drug.
Okay, thank you. Deb? Oh, did we lose? No, there's Deb. You're muted.
We need the publications, of course, and then we will need additional research for longer term effects. But I would also encourage the company to make this as inexpensive as possible, because I think that many, many more women will use it, given that this is a symptomatic condition. The cost is going to be a motivator for actually using it.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that. All right. Paula.
I'm going to cheat a little here because I started saying, how do I keep this real short? So I'm going to ditto Chantel on the shared decision. I think it was Don Casey wrote in the chat something that I think we need to just focus on with respect to shared decision making. I'm dittoing Stephanie on the choice, Deborah on cost. And I just want to say I have learned a lot from this process, just about the process. And I've learned a lot in this and appreciate the opportunity to share my perspective and my perspective representing a group of women that really, really need this a lot. So thank you for this.
Paula, thank you. I really appreciate that. And Claire.
Thank you all so much for including us in this process. I'm going to take advantage of something you said, Steve, about directing something to one of the people. And John Watkins, I would love for there to be a process where the payers have more of a direct ongoing relationship with patient advocacy organizations. We don't get together enough to communicate about things in a more formal process. And I would love to kind of follow up on that and figure out how we could all do that together and provide you that perspective in an ongoing way and not just through this process. And thanks to all of you for putting up with my voice and my sneezing and my Rudolph imitation. And I wish you all the best for the holidays.
It's the right. Yeah, thank you. You won't get John to step aside from that request. So keep your eye on your email.
And thanks for putting up with my poor kitty.
That's all right. We had runny noses, sore throats, and anxious old cats. It was quite a menagerie today. All right, Reem, back to you to lead a roundtable final statement from the CEPAC members themselves. For our policy roundtable folks, though, again, if you can stay to hear their final comments, that's great. If you need to leave, please know that you will hear lots of thanks from them and from me in particular when I make my final statement. But you guys were spectacular today and really fleshed out some of the key issues that are going to hopefully accompany the opportunity to have new treatment options for women with menopause. So Reem, to you.
Thank you, Steve, and thanks everybody from this really very stimulating, excellent discussion. I'm going to ask the members of this Midwest CEPAC to please turn on your camera so I know that you're here. In the I'll speak last, I'm going to start in a different order than we went this morning. So starting with comments from Ingva.
Yes, thank you so much, Reem, and everyone. This has been a very enlightening discussion. I always learn a lot. This is when we create guidelines, which I help many organizations do, it's always so important to hear the patient's voice, and I got a lot of inspiration for today. So thanks for letting me be part of this really important process.
Thank you. Tim Wilt.
Thank you. I apologize for missing part of the meeting. Again, they are always very informative, and particularly the patient perspectives provide so much. I was again struck by the information, particularly I think highlighted by some of the folks about the limited evidence. We want therapies that are effective and safe for everybody, particularly those who don't have access to others. But the paucity of information would make it very hard for me to be really enthusiastic about it at this time. We need better evidence. Thanks.
Thank you, Tim. Timothy McBride.
I'll echo that, and well, thanks to the experts, the ICER staff, and the patient perspective. I was going to also say that it was frustrating because the issue is so important and the costs are so important to the patients, but the lack of peer-reviewed evidence was striking and important, and it just was one of the more frustrating experiences I've had here. Also, I'd like to know more about disparities in this realm too, so I hope as evidence comes out, we learn more about that.
Thank you, Timothy. Stuart.
Thank you. I found that the deliberations today were very successful in obviously further illuminating the burden of menopause, and I thank the clinical experts and patient advocates for that contribution. And second, I think we did do a reasonably successful job in navigating the adjudication of the efficacy of the drug given the absence of published data. Thanks.
Thank you, Stuart. Kurt.
Yeah, some fascinating discussions. And clearly there are unmet needs for more therapies that are safe and effective across the age spectrum that are both accessible and affordable. So thank you for the discussions.
Thanks, Kurt. Jill.
I agree with what the last words were with the policy roundtable. Nothing really more profound to add. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Jill. Greg.
Well, thank you, ICER, for organizing this very interesting meeting. I hope the FDA takes a very hard look at the data that they have or will have in their hands. because we haven't seen any data today. And so I'm echoing what others have already said. We have not seen the evidence. And the FDA is going to have to do that for us to make the right judgment about this. I hope that this drug will work out, but at the moment I remain quite skeptical.
Thank you, Greg. Albert?
Hi, this has been a really interesting and important CEPAC meeting, not only because of the focus on women with menopause, but because it's actually raised this kind of fundamental question for ICER, which is, when is the right timing for public discussion of new technology, new medication, in order to influence policymaking? Because there is a timing that is too late, timing that is too early, and timing that is just right. So I think sometimes we've met when the decisions have already been made. But in this case, we are preceding the decision, which is interesting. So I think this has been a fascinating meeting from just a procedural perspective.
Thank you, Albert. Don?
Yeah, thank you, Reem. I first wanted to thank ICER for my Midwest CPEX fleece, which kept me very warm during the meeting. But I wanted to echo what Albert just said and speak specifically to the manufacturer in terms of thinking very hard, much further upstream about these issues. In particular, we kicked around this term shared decision making like we know what that is. And I put a somewhat of a quasi definition in there about what the components are to make it work. This is a prime example of where we need to give the people who are receiving the therapy the tools and resources to help them make a better decision. Thank you.
Thank you, Don. Bradley?
I'd like to make 2 points. The first, I will tell you, I personally struggle with the very first question on this because it's not typical that we have these ICER CPAC meetings, 2 randomized controlled trials with fairly consistent results between trials. It was clouded by the lack of publications and an inconsistent trial with a lower dose. So I'll tell you, I really struggled, I think, perhaps more than others on that very first question. The second, I'd like to address the Stellis. One of the things that wasn't brought up, but is an evidence report. I would encourage you to look at the budget impact analysis, because there is a path forward for you guys to have a $700 million, maybe even $1 billion a year drug if you price this at the thresholds between $50,000 and $100,000, very realistic assumptions to get there.
Thank you, Bradley. Bijan?
Hi again. Thanks so much for kind of letting me part of this discussion. Actually, I had just one sentence or one word. That was timing. I think going back to what Albert and others have said about the timing, even for me too, I think it was kind of very hard to justify the sort of effectiveness from the 3 trials or 5 trials that were presented. But at the same time, beyond that, also I learned a lot about the conditions, and it is really illuminating to hear what the patient advocates and others have to say about the condition, and also I think Steve and others sort of convinced me as to why it is important to actually have a economic evaluation despite not having 2 head-to-head trials. Thank you.
Thanks, Bijan. Alan? You're muted.
Yeah, sorry. I would agree with the majority of the comments have been made so far by my fellow CPAC members, especially the fleece. I forgot to wear mine. Yeah, the only thing I would add is as broken as the system as we think we might have, we still have countervailing forces. So you have entities that are able to set a price, and you have patients and even control the market, how that product is marketed. And you have a countervailing force that controls access and how much they want to pay and how much the patient's going to pay. And I think those 2 forces will go to bat again, and we'll see what happens. But I do look forward to seeing the additional evidence that may come out from the 4 trial and the other publications that were discussed. I think those will be illuminating. And I actually appreciate CEPAC's effort to try to do this prior to approval, just to look at where the evidence is and to give some guidance before the product is approved. It's difficult for sure, but I can, it's not a perfect process, but I also think there's some value in that, as we've seen from other instances where something comes out without having any, review or any other thought behind it or process like this. So we'll see how this plays out, but I appreciate the thought behind it.
Thank you, Ellen. I believe all the members of the Midwest CEPAC has spoke who are online. I will, my one sentence is, I completely agree of the importance of choices, but we cannot highlight that we really want safe choices for women, and we want the data to support it. We don't want to put anyone in any unnecessary harm. This process also today made us all reflect about the best timing, and I can just say, I don't think it is early to start the discussion. And I want to thank ICER for choosing this topic, highlighting again that we all need to prioritize issues related to different diverse groups, women being one important group to highlight. Before I hand it to you, Steve, I want to thank ICER staff for yet again organizing a wonderful meeting. I really want to thank both Brett and Francisca for outstanding work, really excellent presentations, preparedness to answer questions, and everybody around who participated in the policy roundtable, but especially to our patients and groups representatives, despite illness and despite, I'm sure, a lot of competing priorities right before the holidays. So thank you to all of you. And it is just really great to see the commitment. And maybe the last point, I do appreciate ICER's conscious decision to have a group that is vast majority women, which is great. And we want to see more of that representation when appropriate. So, and Steve, thanks to your leadership. Back to you.
Thank you, Reem. That was very nice, guys. And I just want to thank the policy roundtable at the beginning here, because what's special about these meetings is we hope several things. There's hopefully we all benefit from having some sense of an independent view, and we don't have to be the only voice, but independent views on the evidence are important in our system, because we all know that our system is built on a market that creates lots of conflicts. And even more importantly, it's transparent. A lot of these conversations, to the extent that they happen behind closed doors between payers and manufacturers. Claire, as we talked about, rarely are patients involved in that discussion. And we need a better kind of systematic way for different voices to enter into people's thinking before decisions are actually made. And you guys really provided that, the policy roundtable. You guys were fantastic. In a condition in which we all think we know what we're talking about, you guys really helped broaden our thinking and understanding from a variety of different perspectives. Couple of quick things. One is, if you want to see what I think is the best popular culture evocation of menopause or hot flashes, there's a great TV show called Borgen, which is kind of a Danish House of Cards. Anyway, the prime minister is a woman, and there's a great scene where she's speaking before the European Parliament, and she's having a hot flash, and she basically has to duck out, change a blouse before going into another high-level meeting with somebody else. And she's just like, she's doing all this work trying to manage her hot flashes. And it's not done dramatically. It's just like, this is part of the working life of a woman in power at that age. And it's refreshing in a lot of different ways, but it shows you also how really amazingly consequential the symptoms can be for people as they try to function during a day. That being said, sometimes when ICER does reports, we are grappling with a lot of tensions. One of them is patients are dying of this disease now. And if we wait 3 months, 6 months, people are going to die in that interim. So we need to get this into practice, get it through the FDA, approve it, don't stop, don't slow anything down because we need it now and we can learn about it as we go forward. This is not that situation. Women, it's a serious condition, don't get me wrong, as I just mentioned, but no one is dying tomorrow if we spent more time and got more of these papers through peer review before the FDA and the public has to deal with them. And the FDA, it doesn't have to, it can, anyway, lots I could say about that. But the idea that we have to rush because the company also was part of the process of going for an earlier PDUFA date, to me, there is a joint responsibility of the company and the FDA to help the public. And by that, I mean patients starting and, clinicians to have a firmer grasp of the evidence, because clinical decisions are going to be made that week about people starting a drug, and we should know more about it. And I just think on this scale, this population size of patients who could potentially benefit from this treatment, there should be no rush to judgment, and we really should try to figure this out. I do hope that it becomes a material option for a lot of women, but I'm very concerned that the process has been short-circuited by not having peer-reviewed data available. Lastly, in terms of thinking about it moving into practice, I also want to echo the thoughts that there are all kinds of reasons to go for a lower price than the company could receive. And let me make it clear, they could ask for a certain amount, and I think they should ask for less and raise the price later when the evidence is better on the effectiveness and the safety. They are very unlikely to have competition from another non-hormonal treatment in the short term. And it just feels like they might be giving up a few dollars in the first year or two, but and I understand how hard that can be from a corporate responsibility perspective, but I think it would be very helpful to set a standard by which we do expect better evidence to stimulate, to support pricing when we're talking about a large patient population having access. And if we get a lower price, we just know that that will help it be more available to women of all walks, and that will be important. We just don't want this drug to be another example of how it goes to the well-off, to the well-plugged-in, and everybody else is kind of in a second class bus. So with that, it was a great meeting again. Thank you to the CEPAC for your questions and for your the way that you thought hard about the evidence and all of the contextual issues as well. I'd like to wish you all a really happy holidays, with a hope that next year we get to see each other, that we all get through another winter without too many more red noses and sore throats of more severity. But I'm very proud of this meeting and of the work of the Midwest CEPAC, and I look forward to continuing that next year. So in the final steps, you'll see there that the report will be out in the next month, and we'll have access to the recordings of this meeting available. So thank you again for all your contributions, and I wish you well.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Reem.
You.
Happy holidays, everyone.
You too.
Happy holidays. Thanks all.